Well, good morning, friendship. How are we doing this morning? We had a fantastic Easter service last week, and I know some of you were away visiting family, and other family was here visiting, and it was nice to have a really full house. And it's great to have kind of that spring weather, right? And the sunshine. We got a really important ball practice this afternoon for our church team. We're all pumped up. The season is starting on Thursday. We got known last year as the team that had the most fans come out and cheer on our ball team. So I expect this year to be even better. All right. So bring your lawn chairs and we'll post the schedule somewhere and you can come and watch a few games with us. So it is a lot of fun. And one other thing too, I heard that Brian Thompson is being inducted into the Farmers Hall of Fame. And so that's huge, right? I didn't even know there was a Farmers Hall of Fame, but that's fantastic. And so it's being hosted at SBF. What day is that? On the 28th. On the 28th. And so there should be a sign-up sheet. Patty, did we get one this week or next week? It's up there? Okay, so sign up because it's at SBF and they want to know how many people are coming. So if you want to go to that, just sign up on the sign-up sheet. So that's great. All right. Well, we're starting a new series today, and it's really cool how God is working in us as a church, but also just as in us as individuals as well, right? But the reality is that sometimes we see history and how God works, and God actually works a little bit different in us today because we have different needs, right? We have different concerns. We have different things that are going on in our world. And it might not look the same as it did 50 years ago or 100 years ago or thousands of years ago. But that doesn't mean that theology changes, right? It doesn't mean that God changes. God doesn't change. His word doesn't change. But how he interacts with us as people actually does change because we change, right? I think back even, to the Billy Graham years, right? Some of you remember that really well. Others of you maybe not so much. But Billy Graham would host these massive, tent parties, right, and stadiums eventually, and thousands of people came to know Jesus as their personal Savior because of his ministry. But during that time, most of America had some kind of biblical foundation. They at least, they still prayed in schools. They had some kind of knowledge of basic Bible stories. Maybe at least their grandparents took them to church, that kind of thing. But today, our generation is a little bit different, right? Most of the people that we interact with have no Bible background at all. In fact, they were raised with the belief in science, that there is no benevolent God or creator. And so God actually has to interact with us a little differently because our world looks different. And yet, throughout the generations, one thing remains the same. God is trying to connect with us through our hearts. God is a God of the heart, and he wants to know you and wants you to know him. And so today we're starting a series on 1 Samuel. And I love going back to the Old Testament where there's just so much to learn. These are powerful stories, but we need to understand a few things so that we can learn the lessons for us today, right? Because things were different back then, right? And some people read the Old Testament and just think, oh, that's horrible. Why would God allow that to happen? Right? Or some people read, the crazy, miraculous stuff that God did in that age, and they think, well, that must just be made up, because we don't see that today. But the Bible is the story of God coming to his people and leading them in their generation. And it's a story that really grows over time, right? God is slowly revealing himself to his people throughout the generations and hoping that the people will come to him, that they will give their hearts to him. And eventually it leads to the climax of that story, and that is the death and resurrection of Jesus. Right? That God so loved the world that he gave his Son. And he wants us to give our hearts to him. But the whole concept of Jesus being the sacrificial lamb on the cross for us was actually established in the Mosaic covenant. Its true meaning and depth comes out of the Mosaic covenant. And if you don't know that, well, we miss out on a lot in that sacrifice. Or the idea that Jesus is king and sits at the right hand of God, well, that comes from the Davidic covenant. That he is in the line of David and has the right to sit on the throne as the perfect king in the line of David, a man after God's own heart. And he meets and exceeds all of the requirements. And so I want to go back to these amazing stories. This is 1 Samuel that we're going to look at over the next few weeks, because when we look at the larger picture, which we will, but in all of our lives, God is working in the details. Right? We can look at the larger historical picture, and that's one thing, but God works in these detailed stories and puts it all together in the moment-by-moment story of our lives. And he knows our feelings, and he knows our desires, and he knows our hearts. And 1 Samuel is a book that has this overarching storyline, right? It's leading us somewhere. But in each of these individual stories, God is trying to teach us something about his heart and what he desires of us and how he needs to shape our hearts as individuals. And so this series is called God of the Heart, because we see, we see a person's heart by the things that they do, right? By how they behave, how they care for others. We see their heart in that. And in these stories, we see how God detests evil and how he loves the brokenhearted and cares for them. And so we want to learn through these stories. And so if you bear with me just for a little bit, because in order to kind of set the stage for our first story in 1 Samuel, well, we kind of have to have a bit of a history lesson, okay? Because if we just jump right in, it might be a little bit strange, okay? Because the Netflix show summary of 1 Samuel chapter 1 goes like this: a woman finally gets pregnant and gives her son to the church. That's kind of weird, right? Right? I don't. Maybe you don't have Netflix, but when you go to watch a movie, right, and it gives the little like two-liner kind of thing, right? And it's like, man works in office and then becomes CIA agent, and you're like, why? Like what? Right? It doesn't make any sense. Why would I spend 2 hours of my time watching that? Well, that's kind of like what 1 Samuel chapter 1 is, if you don't understand the larger picture, like the larger concepts, right? And so I want to spend just a few moments looking at what was going on at the time. Because if we think of it in our 21st century mindset, it's going to be a little bit weird. We're not going to be able to understand the lessons that God would have for us, right? Because some of those things change in our culture. The things that we value change, right? The morality doesn't change. God sets the morality. But the things that we value tends to change. And so let's start with the really big picture, and then we'll work our way down into this story. So the time frame of 1 Samuel is 1200 to 1000 BC. Okay, this is known as the early Iron Age. They had just come out of it, the Bronze Age, and the Iron Age refers to iron tools and weapons being used in a more common, everyday way. Okay, so they had been invented long before, but it took a while for it to get into the everyday use of everyday people, right? You think of electricity, right? When electricity was invented, it was just in a lab, right? It was an experiment, it was whatever. But over decades, power generation stations were invented, and high voltage lines, and how the way that you built houses with wires connecting plugs and lights and all that kind of stuff. Now it's just accepted, right? There's you would never build a house without a plug every 10 feet or 12 feet or something, right? And it's getting shorter and shorter because we plug more things in, and but that took time. And so this is the early Iron Age where iron tools and weapons are just starting to be used in an everyday common way. And that's going to be important later on in 1 Samuel. What about politically? Of course, we're talking about the area of Israel because that's where our story takes place. And so in this age, politics were changing. There used to be sort of great empires that would control vast areas of land that were quite far away. And so, Egypt and the Hittites were the large empires, but now it was becoming more regionalized. And at first it was just kings of cities, and then the cities would kind of get together. They were stronger together, and so they would make these little smaller kingdoms around. And there were regional kings. One of the influencing peoples that is important to our story that you need to know about is a people group known as the Sea People. Have you heard of the Sea People? They came from other places around the Mediterranean Sea. They got on their boats, they would come in, they would land, they would conquer, they would pillage, they would, they set up cities and towns and they would kind of take over the area. One of these groups is called the Philistines. Okay, and they had iron technology, which made them very powerful against a fairly unorganized people groups that didn't have iron technology. And so they would come in and they would establish cities, and you might recognize some of the cities that they established, and we read their names in the Bible, like the city of Gaza, or Ashdod, or Ashkelon, or Gath, or Ekron. And they would oppress the local people. They would take exorbitant taxes. They would just come in and just at harvest time and just steal all of the grain and take it away because they could, because they had iron technology. And so we read stories in the book of Judges, right, including the stories of the Philistines oppressing the Israelites. And most of these stories are how the people had walked away from God and were being oppressed, and instead of bringing those things to God, they were trying to do it on their own. And then God would raise up a judge and bring them back to God, and God would rescue them from the oppressors. And he would defeat their enemies. And so in our story, this is the beginning of this political and religious transition in Israel from a time of the judges to the establishment of the kingdom of Israel. And so this is what all the other groups in the area were starting to do, but God wanted his people to have a heart for him. And instead, they just wanted a king to lead them and to protect them. And the issue was not actually political. The issue was with their hearts. And so God leads his people through a process. And what they had been doing wasn't working. The judges would be raised up and they would lead for a time, and then when they would die, the people would just spiral out of control again. And so God would raise up leaders that would follow his heart. And so we can look at the big picture of what was going on in Israel, and we can see the overarching storyline. But the reality is, God always works through individuals like you and me. And he wants our hearts. And he wants us to turn our hearts over to him so that he can work through us. And so the question for us is when we are oppressed, when we are struggling, when there are things going on around us, when politics are changing, when our culture is changing, do we give our hearts to God and allow him to work? With all the chaos going on in Israel, with the people that were far from God, there was unrest at the time. There was a threat of extinction from the Philistines. The temple was a mess, and we'll get to that in the next few chapters. But there was this changing landscape in kingdoms and all of the cultural and political chaos going on. And yet 1 Samuel starts with this personal story of heartbreak. And so we start by looking at a woman who is broken and desperate, and yet her heart is fully towards God, unlike most of the people around her. So this is 1 Samuel chapter 1, verse 1. There was a man from Ramathaim, Zophim, in the hill country of Ephraim. His name was Elkanah, son of Jeroham, son of Elihu, son of Tohu, son of Zoph, an Ephraimite. He had 2 wives, the first named Hannah, and the second Peninnah. Peninnah had children, but Hannah was childless. This man would go up from his town every year to worship and to sacrifice to the Lord of armies at Shiloh, where Eli's 2 sons, Hophni and Phinehas, were the Lord's priests. Whenever Elkanah offered a sacrifice, he always gave portions of the meat to his wife Peninnah and to each of her sons and daughters, but he gave a double portion to Hannah, for he loved her, even though the Lord had kept her from conceiving. Her rival would taunt her severely just to provoke her, because the Lord had kept Hannah from conceiving. Year after year, when she went up to the Lord's house, her rival taunted her in this way, and Hannah would weep and would not eat. "Hannah, why are you crying?" her husband Elkanah would ask. "Why don't you eat? Why are you troubled? Am I not better to you than 10 sons?" Well, this kind of sets a stage for our story. There's this rich man named Elkanah. We know that he is well off because he has 2 wives. Okay, this sounds strange to our ears. But in the Bible, it's not saying that this is okay or that this is ideal. It's just telling it how it was. Most men did not have 2 wives because it was very expensive. So we can tell that he's wealthy, right? And so, if you were wealthy, you could manage to have 2 wives, and 2 wives would actually potentially double your children. And the more children you had, the more family you would have to work the family farm. And you would be able to be more successful, and you would be able to plant more and to harvest more. And so this was financially beneficial, except that you had more mouths to feed in the meantime, right? And so you better be pretty wealthy. That's just the way it was. However, as we read, these 2 wives had some issues with each other. Hannah could not bear children, which in those days was a disgrace. It was an embarrassment. Right? I mean, if you had 2 wives to double your children, but one of them didn't have children, well, that's a problem. Again, I'm not saying this is right or wrong. This is just the way it was. Okay, this is how they thought of family. This is what they put their value in. But it says that Elkanah loved her anyway. Now, you might think, well, of course he should. It's his wife. Yeah, but we would be thinking about that in our 21st century mindset, right? That would be our values today. Our world has taken the value out of having children and raising a family and put it on career and money. But back then, family was everything. Children was everything. And the value of a wife was seen in her ability to give her husband children. And Hannah couldn't do that. But instead of writing her off, Elkanah loved her anyway. That's actually a beautiful thing. Sometimes in marriage, you just can't pull your own weight. And yet he loved her, even though she felt useless, even though she didn't meet the cultural expectations, but his heart was for his wife. And so he would give her a double portion. But the other wife was brutal and mocked her relentlessly and taunted her and made her feel worthless. And Elkanah tried to comfort Hannah, right? Am I not better than 10 sons? No. And she was brokenhearted. And so what does she do? What do you do when you're brokenhearted? When you feel worthless, when you feel desperate? Well, she takes it to the Lord. She knows that her only hope is in him. And so verse 9 says, on one occasion, Hannah got up after they ate and drank at Shiloh, and the priest Eli was sitting on a chair by the doorpost of the Lord's temple. Deeply hurt, Hannah prayed to the Lord and wept with many tears. Making a vow, she pleaded, Lord of armies, if you will take notice of your servant's affliction, remember and not forget me, and give your servant a son, I will give him to the Lord all the days of his life, and his hair will never be cut. While she continued praying to the Lord's presence, in the Lord's presence, Eli watched her mouth. Hannah was praying silently, although her lips were moving. Her voice could not be heard. And Eli thought that she was drunk, and said to her, how long are you going to be drunk? Get rid of your wine. No, my Lord, Hannah replied, I am a woman with a broken heart. I haven't had any wine or beer. I've been pouring out my heart before the Lord. Don't think of me as a wicked woman. I've been praying from the depth of my anguish and resentment. Eli responded, go in peace. And may the Lord of Israel grant the request you've made of him. May your servant find favor with you, she replied. And then Hannah went on her way. She ate and no longer looked despondent. These stories are great. I love reading through the Old Testament stories, but part of why I love it is because it's just real life. And there's so many principles that still apply to us today, right? Because even though our culture has changed and many things have changed, we as people really haven't changed a whole lot. And you may read this story and you can, get your own lessons out of it. God can use these stories to speak into our lives in any way he chooses. And you could look at the love that Elkanah has for his wife in that cultural time, or you can see the assumption that the priest Eli makes, right? Of not jumping to conclusions and judging people on how they look or those kinds of things. And I mean, to be fair, it was probably he's assuming things that are common in the cultural place. It was probably more rare to have a woman pouring out her heart before the Lord in those days than it would be for a woman to be drunk in the temple. That's where their culture was at. But I want to look at the principles that Hannah teaches us and what we can learn from the heart of God in this case, because this story has huge ramifications, not just in Hannah's life, but in all of Israel and even to you today, 3,000 years later. And so here's the first one, the first lesson for us. Hannah brings her broken heart before the Lord. And that seems pretty simple, doesn't it? I mean, that's something that we should do, but it's actually something that we forget all the time. In Philippians chapter 4, verse 6, it says, "Don't worry about anything, but in everything, through prayer and petition, with thanksgiving, present your requests to God. And the peace of God, which surpasses all understanding, will guard your hearts and minds in Christ Jesus." I think no matter who you are, there's probably been a time in your life, if you're not going through it right now, where you felt useless, where you felt hopeless, or maybe you had an enemy that was endlessly tormenting you. Maybe even a time that you look at the chaos going on in the world and think, my goodness, what is happening? Or a time when you're filled with anxiety and worry. Anxiety is the number one problem with young people today. Because we've forgotten the lesson of Hannah. Eli assumes that she's drunk, because that's how people deal with anxiety often, isn't it? When they're depressed, when they're worried, when they're anxious, we try to medicate it, we try to numb it, we try to forget it. Everything but actually deal with the problem. And what is the problem? Well, the problem is there are things in this life that we can't control. And yet our sinful nature says we need to control everything. And the reality is we can only be free of these anxieties if we believe that God not only exists, but that He loves us and that He wants to be involved in our lives and He can be trusted. And He can be trusted. 1 Peter 5, verse 6 says, "Humble yourselves, therefore, under the mighty hand of God, so that He may exalt you at the proper time, casting all your cares on Him, because He cares about you." Hannah brings her desperate heart, her broken heart, and lays it before the Lord. But she doesn't just tell God about her troubles, right? I mean, you can do that to anybody. You can do that with your hairdresser, right? You can complain about all kinds of things. We do that all the time, right? We complain about all kinds of things. But bringing our anxieties to the Lord isn't just complaining to the Lord about things. She's not complaining. She's bringing her troubles to the only one who can do something about it. To the one that knows her heart, to the one that loves her and cares for her. And then she commits her troubles to Him and makes a promise. And that's the second thing. She makes a promise to the Lord that if He would bless her, she would give that blessing back to Him. Verse 11 says, making a vow, she pleaded, "Lord of armies, if you will take notice of your servant's affliction, remember and not forget me, and give your servant a son. I will give him to the Lord all the days of his life, and his hair will never be cut." Do you see the difference in this compared to many of our requests, right? Do we go before the Lord and say, "Lord, if you would do this for me, that'd be great because I really am pretty good and I deserve it. Or do we complain, right? Do we complain? Do we say, Lord, I can't believe you haven't done this for me. I've been so good. Or do we get angry with God and say, God, how could you do this to me? How could you let this happen? No, she says, if you will look upon me with favor, I will give back to you the very thing that you will bless me with. Lord, this is about your glory, not mine, but would you relieve my anguish, and I will honor you with it. And when we ask the Lord for things that we so desperately want, is it for my benefit or is it for the glory of the Lord? Are we willing to give it back to him and allow his will to take place even if it's not in our wants and our desires? Do you pray that God will bless your business or your investments or your career, but then you don't tithe back to him and honor him with your finances? Do you worry about money, but then don't honor God or trust him? Do you pray for things and ask God for things and maybe demand things from God, but then in the rest of your life you don't actually honor him and live for him, and your heart is not softened and humbled to him? You see, the Lord sees our hearts, and he knows what our motives are. 2 Corinthians 9 verse 7 says, each person should do as he has decided in his heart, not reluctantly or out of compulsion, since God loves a cheerful giver. God cares about our hearts. He wants our hearts. It is about your heart attitude towards him, not in the giving. And you should be honoring God with your gift. And your heart should be in it. And Hannah is offering her son to the Lord. Psalm 3 verse 5, trust in the Lord with all your heart, and do not rely on your own understanding. And that brings us to the third lesson. She trusted in the Lord to provide. I mean, look how the story ends here, right? Eli, the priest, is a little sheepish for assuming that she's drunk, right? But he's still the voice of God at this point. He is still the high priest. And in verse 17, Eli responds, go in peace, and may the God of Israel grant the request you've made of him. And she responds, may your servant find favor with you. And then Hannah went on her way, and she ate and no longer looked despondent. She trusted that she had laid her request before God, and she made a vow, and now God will do what God does. And she's okay with it. If there's no child, then it's God's will. If there is a child, then she will honor her vow. And she no longer looks despondent. She no longer is anxious and stressed. She's no longer depressed about it. She has laid it at the Lord's feet and says, God, I trust you to do your will. And I'm okay with it either way. Do you have that kind of faith in God? When you lay your requests before him with an upright heart, loving God, longing to do his will, do you walk away from laying your requests and your anxieties at his feet? And do you walk away with joy, knowing that God heard you and he loves you, and whatever he determines is good? Do you trust like Hannah and allow your heart to be set right again? She came to God with a broken heart, and now she is leaving with a confident heart because God heard her. Imagine what that would do in your life if you dealt with stress and life's problems by bringing it to God first and laying it at His feet and trusting that the Lord has heard my requests. He knows my heart, and He loves me. And I know my God is good, and whatever decision He makes and whatever He provides is good. And so I will have joy and be filled with thanksgiving. How would our attitudes change? How would our anxiety and stress levels change? For that matter, how would our health change if we were able to give it to the Lord and walk away with joy, knowing that He heard me and He loves me and I trust Him with my problems? If we give our hearts to Him. The story ends, of course, with Hannah returning home. She gets pregnant and she has a son and names him Samuel. And she weans him, and then she gives him to the Lord. Now, please understand, and I need to be very clear here. This is not a common practice, and I am not advocating in any way that you should give your children to the church, okay? Make sure you go and pick them up from kids' church after this. Do not leave them here. We don't want your kids, okay? That's not the point of this story. Okay? But instead, the lesson here is about how God works through a broken and contrite heart, a heart that is humbled before Him. And that's the fourth lesson for us today, is God works through the humble and the broken. We began by looking at the big picture, right? And what's going on in the history of the area and the nation, but the story of God working is in the life and the details of this woman, Hannah. And her heart is broken before the Lord, and she's just bearing her soul before the Lord and laying it at His feet. And she committed her soul to God, and as a result, Samuel was dedicated to the Lord and then served in the temple. And spoiler alert, if you haven't read the whole story, but Samuel then replaces Eli as the high priest and judge of Israel, and he anoints their first king in King Saul. And when King Saul proves that his heart is not for God, then God sends Samuel out to find King David. And King David starts the line of kings of Israel that is completed in Jesus, our eternal King. Your King. And so this decision, the heart of Hannah laid bare before the Lord, has consequences even today. He is the God of the heart. And He takes a broken and surrendered heart and not only transforms the life of Hannah. What did it say? She had 7 kids, right, in her song in chapter 2. Not only did He transform the life of Hannah, but He transformed the history of Israel. And then the eternal history through King Jesus. Because Hannah was willing to surrender her heart to the Lord. And whenever you are feeling useless, whenever you are feeling discouraged or overwhelmed or anxious, maybe you're feeling tormented by an enemy who is continually poking at you, remember the story of Hannah. because we need to bring these things and lay them at the foot of the cross and say, Jesus, you are my King, and I give these things to you. And I know that you love me and you care for me, and you will take them and use them for your glory if our hearts are surrendered to him. And you may have a request, and the answer might be no. But we can walk away with joy knowing that that answer was God's, and he is good, and he loves us. And we can give thanksgiving that he heard our requests and he cares for us. That is the lesson of Hannah. Not that Hannah did something to get a baby, but the lesson here is in all of the chaos that was going on in the world. God focuses on the heart of one broken woman and uses it to transform the nation and the world. So what can he do with your heart if you humble yourself before him and you give your heart to him? How can he use you to transform our broken world, the world around us that desperately needs the hope that Jesus brings? He wants to work through you, but he can't work through us unless we surrender our hearts to him. And I hope through this series in 1 Samuel, we're going to see different aspects and different situations and different people that do and don't humble their heart before God. And we get to see how God works through that. So may we start by learning the lesson of Hannah. We need to humble ourselves before the Lord and walk away with joy, knowing that he is good and he loves us and he cares for us. Let's pray. Jesus, we thank you for your great love for us. We thank you for your sacrifice on the cross, the climax of your story coming to us and showing us your heart for us and how we need to turn our hearts over to you. And even throughout the course of all of history and how you were working, you work through us in each moment, just like Hannah. In our brokenness, as we come before you and lay our hearts before you, you care and you love us. And you will transform us to be into your people. Father, help us as we lay our anxieties and our problems and our struggles before you. Help us to lay that at your feet and then to walk away with joy, knowing that you have heard us and you love us. And we are good with whatever you do. Give us a peace in our heart. Allow us to know you more.